The desert didn't care if you lived or died. It stretched endlessly and was empty, a vast graveyard of dust and silence, where only the wind remembered names. Jonah Pike had walked it long enough to understand that truth. Every step he took kicked up ghosts, of the men he'd known in the mines, of the sound of steel on rock, of chains rattling in the dark. By the time the sun began to fall, the heat had turned cruel. The sky bruised gold and purple. Jonah crested a ridge, scanning the horizon for water, for shade, for anything that wasn't dying. That's when he saw the smoke, a thin black curl rising from the canyon floor below. Not campfire smoke. No, this was the bitter kind, thick with grease and ruin. He hesitated, fingers brushing the handle of his revolver. Trouble, his instincts warned. But then again, the West never offered much else. He led his tired horse down the slope, slow and wary. The closer he got, the worse the smell became. Charred wood, burned leather, and something else. Something human. The wagon had been torched clean through. Scorched crates and shattered harnesses lay scattered in the sand. A company brand stamped into every splinter. Holt Mining. Jonah's jaw tightened. He knew that name. Everyone who'd worked the deep canyons did. He took one cautious step around the wreck and then froze. A sound, barely a whisper. Please. At first he thought it was the wind. Then he saw her. A woman, tied to a splintered post by the wreck, wrists and ankles shackled in iron. Her dress, once blue, hung in filthy tatters. The desert had baked her skin raw. Her lips were cracked, bleeding. Around her neck, the faint glint of a metal tag, the same kind the mining company branded onto its indentured assets. Jonah's pulse jumped. He knelt beside her, shading her face with his hat. Hey now, you're alive. Can you hear me? Her eyes fluttered open, gray as storm clouds, unfocused. She flinched when he touched the chain. Don't. Her voice broke. Please don't take me back. I'm not with them, he said quietly. Name's Jonah. I ain't with them. But she didn't believe him, not yet. Fear had carved itself deep into her skin like the welts around her wrists. Jonah tugged gently on the chain. It was bolted to the post, sunk deep. He looked around for tools, found a blackened crowbar near the wreck. His hand trembled as he picked it up. Every instinct screamed, walk away. The company hunted their runaways. Anyone caught helping one ended up swinging from the same gallows, but the sight of her, small, broken, left to die, brought something burning up through the guilt he'd buried years ago. He wedged the crowbar under the bolt and leaned his full weight into it. The metal groaned. Sweat ran down his temple. The woman stirred weakly. They'll kill you, she whispered. Jonah's jaw set. They already tried. The bolt snapped loose with a sharp metallic crack. He caught her as she slumped forward, the chain falling away from her wrists. She was light. Too light. He carried her to the shade of a boulder and poured what little water he had over her lips. Her name came out in fragments when she finally spoke again. Ruth called her. Jonah nodded. You're safe now, Ruth. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. Not yet. He gathered what supplies he could from the wreck, a canteen, a half-burned blanket, a rusted pistol missing half its bullets. Then he built a small fire, enough to ward off the night chill. As the stars bled through the dark, Jonah sat by the flames, watching Ruth breathe shallow and slow. Somewhere out there, he knew men and dusters were already tracking the smoke, the trail, the rumor of an escaped asset. And Jonah Pike, who'd spent years trying to forget the mines and the sound of chains, had just given them a reason to remember his name. He stared into the fire, the crowbar still streaked with rust and guilt beside him. Guess you ain't the only one with shackles, he murmured. The desert wind answered, low and endless, a sound halfway between a sigh and a warning. The desert dawn came pale and thin, washing the camp in light the color of bone. Jonah Pike stirred the coals back to life. the faint crackle sounding too loud in the emptiness. Ruth Calder lay a few feet away, wrapped in his spare blanket. Her breathing was steadier now, but every twitch of her hands told of nightmares that hadn't yet ended. He poured a little water into the tin cup, warmed it, then mixed what remained of his hardtack crumbs into a paste. "Ain't much," he said quietly, "but it'll sit better than the dust." Ruth opened her eyes, blinking at him as though he were another hallucination. She sat up slowly, wincing at the pull on her wrists. The iron bruises there looked like brands of their own. "Where am I?" 2 days east of Red Hollow, about 40 miles from the canyon works. At the mention of the works, her expression turned sharp, half fear, half defiance. You work for them?" Jonah shook his head. "Used to." That word hung between them like the desert heat. Used to. He didn't elaborate, not yet. Instead, he handed her the tin cup. She stared at it suspiciously, then took a small sip. Her hands trembled so badly that he had to steady the cup for her. "I saw their mark on your neck," he said softly. "They do that to all the ones they keep?" Ruth's eyes filled with something too hard to be tears. "Keep? They buy us. From prisons, from debts, from families that need to eat. They promise freedom after 5 years. She let out a bitter laugh. "No one ever lasts that long." Jonah looked away toward the ridge, jaw tightening. "Yeah, I know." Ruth's gaze lingered on him. "You said you used to work for Holt Mining. What were you, a guard?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "Foreman," her eyes flashed. "Then you're one of them." Jonah didn't argue. The accusation hit too close to home. He'd heard the screams, seen men chained, women dragged back from escape, and he'd told himself he couldn't stop it, that it wasn't his fight. He set his coffee down and stood. "I left that place years ago. Never looked back." Ruth's voice was a whisper edged with steel. "And how's that working out? Running from ghosts?" Jonah didn't answer. The question hurt more than the desert sun. He began to pack the bedrolls, strapping them onto his horse. "There's a town a day's ride west, Mesa Ford. You can rest there. Find a doctor, maybe work?" "I'm not stopping there," she said, rising shakily. "I'm going back." Jonah turned, stunned. "Back?" Her voice hardened. "There are others still in those pits, chained, same as me. I'm not leaving them." Jonah's stomach knotted. "You go back, you won't make it out twice. Holt's got riders, dogs, and men who'd shoot a shadow if it looked like it had a conscience. I can't just leave them." He faced her, his shadow long across the sand. "You can and you will. Freedom only means something if you live long enough to use it." She stared at him, jaw trembling. "That's easy for you to say. You already have yours." Jonah didn't reply. He cinched his saddle tighter than it needed to be, each pull a silent argument he couldn't win. When he looked back, Ruth had turned away, her shoulders stiff with fury and grief. She was barefoot, bruised, half-starved, and still talking about saving others. He almost admired her for it. Almost. "Listen," he said finally, voice softer. "You come with me to Mesa Ford. Once you're safe, you can do what you please." She didn't answer, just walked a few paces from camp, staring west toward the horizon that shimmered like fire. Jonah mounted his horse and extended a hand down to her. "You can walk if you like, but it's a long road." She hesitated, glaring up at him. Then, without a word, she took his hand. Her grip was weak, but her eyes, those storm-gray eyes, were unbroken. As they rode out, the wind carried the faint clink of metal from the ruined wagon behind them, the chains swaying gently like wind chimes for the dead. Neither spoke again that morning, but both felt the same thing rising in their chests, a strange, dangerous stirring of something they'd both buried long ago. Hope. By the time they reached the dry wash below the ridge, the sun had turned white and merciless again. Jonah and Ruth rode slowly, conserving the horse's strength. The desert stretched out endlessly and quietly, too quiet. Ruth's back was straight now, her shoulders sunburned but proud. She'd found her voice again in fragments, asking short questions, then falling silent before he could answer. Jonah didn't press. The desert was a better listener anyway. When they reached a line of old telegraph poles, Jonah's hand drifted to his revolver. He saw it then, hoof prints. Fresh ones. He swung down, kneeling beside the tracks. Riders, 6, maybe 7. Heavy horses. He brushed the dust off his hands, eyes narrowing. They're not miners. That's bounty gear, Ruth stiffened. They're looking for me. Jonah didn't argue. They'll find us easy if we keep to the flats. Come on. He led her toward the ruins of a water tower half a mile off, a rusted skeleton leaning over a dried-up tank. The structure offered little shade, but it'd do for hiding. Inside, the air was cool and stale. Jonah motioned for silence. Stay here, he whispered. Don't move. No matter what you hear, she caught his wrist. You're not leaving me. I ain't leaving. Just making sure they pass by. Her grip loosened reluctantly. Jonah stepped outside, moving low along the ridge until he saw them. 6 riders in dusters, guns glinting in the light. Their leader rode in front with a rifle across his saddle and a paper in his hand. Jonah didn't need to see the name. He knew what it said. Ruth Calder, property of Holt Mining Company. The riders stopped near the old wagon road. One dismounted, kicked at the dirt, and pointed toward the smoke trail still faintly visible in the distance. Jonah held his breath. He could almost hear their spurs. Spread out, the lead rider barked. Tracks lead west. She's with someone. Prince showed 2 sets. A man and a woman. We catch him, Mr. Holt doubles the reward. The others cheered lowly, the kind of laugh that carried cruelty. Jonah's knuckles whitened on his revolver. He could shoot one, maybe 2, before the others turned him to dust. But that wasn't freedom, it was suicide, so he waited. The riders split, 3 heading south, 3 west. When the sound of hooves finally faded, Jonah exhaled the breath he'd been holding too long. He turned back toward the water tower, then froze. The door was open. Ruth? No answer. He ducked inside. She was crouched in the shadows, trembling, staring at something in her hands. He stepped closer, and his chest went tight. She was looking at her wrists, the skin raw where the shackles had cut deep. Her fingers traced the marks as though they were still bound. I heard them, she whispered, the way they talked, like I was cattle. Like I wasn't even a person. Jonah knelt beside her. You're not what they said you are. Her eyes lifted to his. Then what are you? He hesitated, his throat dry. A coward, he said finally. Once I looked away when others were chained, same as you. Figured it wasn't my place. Told myself I couldn't do nothing against the company. He looked at his hands, rough, scarred, unclean. But every man who looked away was part of the chain. The silence stretched. Outside, the desert wind moaned through the gaps in the tower like a mournful hymn. Ruth's voice broke softly. Why'd you come back then?
Why help me?
He gave a small hollow laugh. Because maybe I was hoping for a chance to break something that ain't metal. Her gaze softened. Not forgiveness. Not yet, but understanding. After a long while, she said quietly, take me as far as Mesa Ford, I'll find a way from there. Jonah nodded once, relief hidden behind his gruffness. All right, Mesa Ford it is. He rose and glanced westward to where the canyon wall shimmered in the heat haze. But we ride nights from now on. Holt's men got eyes like hawks in daylight. Ruth managed a small smile, faint but real. Then we ride under the same moon. Jonah returned it, brief and uncertain. He helped her onto the horse, the metal of her broken shackles clinking faintly as she moved. As they set off toward the horizon, Jonah felt something strange loosen in his chest. A knot he hadn't known he'd carried. Behind them, the desert swallowed the sound of pursuit, but not the memory of chains. He didn't look back. Night came softer than usual that day. A swollen moon hung over the desert, turning every dune silver and every cactus into a ghost. Jonah Pike rode ahead, the faint jingle of his spurs barely breaking the silence. Ruth sat behind him, clutching the saddle horn, her head bowed but her gaze steady. She hadn't spoken much since the water tower, but the tremor in her voice was gone. By dawn, they reached the old ghost town of Calico Wells, a scatter of half-collapsed buildings, long abandoned after the wells ran dry. Jonah dismounted first, scanning the shadows out of habit. "Town's dead," he said. "No one will bother us here." Ruth slid off the horse, legs shaking. "I'd forgotten what walls look like." He offered a faint smile. "Don't get too fond. Roofs leak worse than the sky." They took shelter in the old saloon, its floor blanketed in dust and bottles still lined like sentries along the bar. Jonah built a small fire in a rusted stove, while Ruth found a cracked mirror hanging behind the counter. She wiped it with her sleeve, staring at her reflection as if she didn't recognize it. "I don't look like her anymore," she murmured. "Who's her?" "The woman I used to be. Before they—" She stopped, jaw tightening. Jonah looked up from the stove. "Names matter more than faces. The face changes. The name's what they couldn't steal." She turned toward him, faint amusement flickering through the pain. "You sound like a preacher," he snorted. No preacher ever made it this far from a town. When the fire caught, its glow reached the cracked walls and the dust motes dancing like ghosts. For the first time, Jonah saw Ruth without the grime and shadows. She wasn't fragile, just worn like the land itself. He poured her a cup of coffee, thin but hot. "You're walking steadier now." "I'm remembering how." He nodded approvingly. "Good. You'll need it if we're to make Mesa Ford before the week's end." Ruth sipped, then said quietly, "You talk like a man who knows what it's like to start over." Jonah hesitated. "Ain't so easy for some of us." Her eyes lingered on him, patient but insistent. "What happened in the mines, Jonah?" He stared into the fire. The crackling sounded too much like pickaxes. "You want the truth?" "Yes. I wasn't just a worker." His voice dropped. "I was a foreman, hired to keep the peace, keep the line moving. When men fell behind, I looked the other way when Holt's enforcers dragged him off. Figured that's how things were. Figured doing my job meant staying alive." Ruth's cup paused halfway to her lips. "And when you left?" "I couldn't stand it anymore. The screams, the smell, the chains." He rubbed his palms together as if still feeling iron there. "I walked out one night. Didn't free anyone. Didn't look back till I found you." Silence thickened. Ruth stared at him a long time, weighing something deeper than judgment. Then she said softly, "Freedom without forgiveness is another kind of cage." Jonah looked up, caught off guard. She went on, voice trembling but fierce. "You think you owe a debt you can't repay, so you keep paying it in guilt. But guilt's just another set of chains, only you hold the key." He swallowed hard, words stuck in his throat. "You talk like you've done forgiving yourself." Her eyes darkened. "I haven't, not yet. But I'm learning how." For a long while, the only sound was the pop of firewood and the whisper of the wind through broken shutters. Outside, dawn stretched pale and cold across the desert. Jonah stood, pulled his coat tight, and looked out toward the west. "Mesa Ford's 2 days from here." "We'll ride at dusk," Ruth nodded, following his gaze. "And after Mesa Ford?" He didn't answer right away. "We'll figure that when we get there." As she stepped past him, she brushed his arm, barely, but enough to jolt something awake inside him. Something he hadn't felt in years. Trust. They packed in silence. But the silence had changed. It wasn't the wary quiet of strangers anymore. It was the fragile calm of two people walking the same road, both hoping the next bend might finally lead them somewhere they could stop running. As they rode out, Jonah glanced back at the ghost town fading behind them. For the first time in a long while, he muttered, half to himself, "Maybe I ain't looking back in shame." Ruth, hearing him, said softly, "Then you're finally facing forward." The air grew heavier as they neared the Red Canyon rim. Ruth felt it first, the stillness before a storm. Jonah noticed it next, the way the wind carried a low hum through the rocks. A sound that didn't belong. "Something's wrong," he murmured. By the time they found the abandoned trail that wound through the gorge, the horse was uneasy, stamping and snorting. Ruth leaned close. "They're out there, aren't they?" Jonah scanned the ridges. "If Holt wants his property back, he'll send men who know how to track ghosts." They pushed on anyway, the canyon narrowing around them like a throat. Every echo of hooves bounced off the stone louder, closer, until another sound split the silence. Gunfire. The first bullet hit a rock near Ruth's boot, spraying dust. Jonah swung off the saddle, shouting, "Down!" They dove behind a boulder as shouts rang through the canyon walls. Shapes moved above them, riders, rifles glinting in the sun. Jonah returned fire, his shots careful and steady. "Run when I say," he hissed. "I'm not leaving." He cut her off. "Not asking." He fired again, dropped one of the men from his horse, then grabbed Ruth's wrist. They scrambled deeper into the canyon, gunfire chasing their heels. When the echoes faded, they reached a bend that opened into a dry creek bed. Jonah slowed, listening. That's when he heard hooves again. Too close. A man's voice boomed through the dust. Well, well. The ghost foreman himself. Jonah's blood went cold. He knew that voice. Silas Holt rode into view, sun cutting sharp over his pale hat brim. The mine owner's son, young, handsome, and rotten to the core. His coat was fine leather, his smile smug. Behind him, 5 riders spread out, rifles trained. Ruth's breath hitched. "That's him." Jonah stepped forward, revolver raised. "Let her go, Holt. You've got no claim on her," Silas smirked. "No claim?" Holt Mining paid $300 for that one. "She's a debt, Pike, and debts get collected." He nodded to his men. "Take her alive." "Kill him slow," Jonah fired first. Chaos exploded. Ruth tried to run, but one of Holt's men swung his rifle butt into her side. She crumpled with a cry. Jonah turned toward her, too slow. Another man tackled him, driving him into the dirt. Fists flew. He caught one, landed a punch, but then something hard cracked against his temple. When the world steadied, he was on his knees, arms pinned. Ruth was bound again, wrists tied cruelly behind her back. Silas stepped close, his boots stirring red dust. "You know, Pike, I used to hear stories about you." The foreman who went soft, the one who ran. He crouched, voice low. "You should have stayed gone." He backhanded Jonah across the jaw, then tossed a length of chain toward his men. "Let's see how it feels to sit where you once stood." They dragged him to a splintered fence post and lashed his arms behind it, wrapping the broken chain around his chest. The metal bit into his skin. The smell of iron and dust filled his nose. Silas looked from Jonah to Ruth. "You'll both hang before sundown." He tipped his hat mockingly. "Company policy." With a cruel grin, he turned and rode off toward the mining camp down the canyon, his men following, except 2, who stayed behind to guard them. Jonah tested the chains. They held firm. The guards leaned against their horses, laughing, one swigging from a canteen. Ruth lay nearby, tied at the ankles but conscious, eyes burning. "Jonah." He forced a grin through blood. "Don't you worry about me." She shook her head fiercely. "You saved me once. Now you listen, you don't quit. You hear me?" Jonah gave a low laugh. "Ain't planning on it." As night crept down the canyon walls, one of the guards dozed. Jonah shifted, feeling for weakness. The chain was old, brittle with rust. He twisted, forcing his shoulder hard against the post. Pain ripped through him, but the link gave a little. He remembered the sound from that day he found Ruth. The snap of metal. The release. Now it was his turn. He twisted again, harder. A link broke with a dull clank. The guard stirred, muttered something, then went back to sleep. Jonah froze. When silence returned, he pulled free the last coil and rose, staggering. He looked down at the broken chain in his hand and felt something inside him break loose too. He went to Ruth, crouched beside her. "You ready to run again?" Her eyes widened. "You're free." He smiled, grim and determined. "Not yet." Not till he stopped. Far down the canyon, firelight flickered where Holt's men camped. Jonah looked toward it like a man staring into the mouth of his own past. "Time to settle the score," he whispered. The canyon was a wound in the earth, glowing orange under the dying sun. Jonah Pike moved through it like a shadow, one arm bound against his ribs, the other gripping the rusted chain he'd torn free. Every step was a reminder of pain, but it also reminded him that pain meant he was still alive. Behind him, Ruth followed close, barefoot and silent. Her wrists were raw again, but her eyes, they burned with something fierce and unbreakable. Below, the Holt mining camp sprawled across the canyon floor. Rows of iron cages, furnaces belching black smoke, men and women working under rifle guard. Their faces were hollow, their chains shining dully in the firelight. Jonah stared down, breath catching in his throat. He'd walked this ground before, years ago, when he was the one giving orders, not taking them. He turned to Ruth. "Once we start, there's no turning back." Her voice came steady. "Then we start." Jonah nodded once, then slipped down the rocky slope. The guards nearest the smelting pit were half drunk, laughing around a fire. Jonah waited until the wind picked up, then moved fast. The first man never saw him coming. A swing of a chain, a thud, and he went down without a sound. The second reached for his pistol, but Ruth lunged from the dark, grabbing his arm and shoving him backward into the flames. He screamed, the others turning, and too late. Gunfire split the night. The camp erupted into chaos. Jonah ran for the cages, shouting, "Get back! Stand clear!" He smashed the lock with a guard's dropped rifle, the metal screeching open. The prisoner stared at him in disbelief. "Go!" he barked. "Run for the ridge! You're free!" For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a woman, older, half-starved, stepped out first. The rest followed, stumbling into the night like ghosts rising from graves. Across the camp, Silas Holt burst from his tent, fury twisting his face. "Pike!" Jonah turned at the sound, chest heaving. "It's over, Silas." Holt laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Over? You think this ends with a few peasants running loose?" He cocked his pistol, dragging Ruth forward by the arm. She'd tried to circle the camp, but he'd caught her. Now he pressed the barrel to her temple. "You want to free something, Foreman?" he snarled. "Start with her soul." Jonah froze. "Let her go." Holt's grin widened. "You first," he fired. Jonah didn't thank him, he just moved. Stepped between her and the gun. The shot hit him square in the shoulder, spinning him backward. Pain flared white-hot, stealing his breath. Ruth screamed, breaking free of Holt's grip, catching Jonah as he fell. Blood soaked her hands. "You fool," Holt hissed, leveling his gun again. "You should have stayed in your chains." Before he could fire again, a roar rose behind him, the freed miners. Dozens of them, wielding shovels, picks, anything they could find. Fury made them fearless. They charged. Holt turned, shouted, but the wave crashed over him. A blow from a pickaxe knocked his pistol away. Another man, the old one Jonah had once supervised, swung a shovel, catching Holt square across the jaw. He went down screaming. The workers didn't stop. Years of rage poured out in one brutal moment. The camp burned, the cages shattered, the air filled with the sound of chains breaking and metal melting. Ruth dragged Jonah away from the pit, her body trembling with strength she didn't know she had. They collapsed behind a wagon, firelight flickering on their faces. Jonah tried to speak, but she pressed a hand to his lips. "Don't, save your breath." He managed a faint smile. "Didn't think you'd listen to me. I learned from you," she whispered. "You didn't run," he coughed, blood on his teeth. "Didn't have anywhere left to run to." She tore a strip from her skirt and pressed it hard against the wound. Around them, flames roared, turning the night to gold and shadow. Jonah's voice was weak but steady. "You get to Mesa Ford, tell the marshal what Holt did. Tell him. They're free now. You're coming with me. Ruth," she glared through tears. "You found me in chains, Jonah. You think I'd leave you in yours?" He couldn't argue with that. The canyon burned, smoke rising into the stars. Men shouted, Women wept, and the desert wind carried the sound far and wide, the sound of something ending and something beginning. Jonah leaned against her shoulder, breath shallow. "Guess I broke more than one chain tonight." Ruth held him tighter, her own tears lost in the smoke. "No, Jonah. You just learned how to live without them." Above them, the fire reached the Holt banner. The emblem caught, curled, and turned to ash. Freedom, fragile, hard-won, shimmered in the heat, and the night went quiet. By the time the first light crept over the canyon rim, the Holt mining camp was nothing but smoke and ruin. The fires had eaten everything: the furnaces, the cages, the banners. The miners were gone, scattered into the desert, chasing whatever future they could find. And through it all, Ruth Calder half-carried, half-dragged Jonah Pike toward the open plains. He was pale, bleeding through his torn shirt, every step a tremor, but his jaw stayed locked, his eyes stubborn and alive. "Jonah," she pleaded, "you need rest." "Not yet." He winced as he climbed into the saddle. "We ride to Mesa Ford. You said you wanted justice, didn't you?" She hesitated. "You can barely stand." He met her gaze, a faint grin flickering under the pain. "I ain't standing." "I'm riding." So they rode. The journey was long, their pace slow, every hoofbeat thudding like a heartbeat on the edge of breaking. Ruth kept her arm around him, feeling the warmth of his blood seeping through the fabric, and every time he faltered she whispered, "Just a little farther." By dusk the horizon broke open, a cluster of rooftops and smoke rising from chimneys. Mesa Ford. Civilization. The first they'd seen in weeks. Jonah slumped in the saddle, half-conscious. Ruth spurred the horse forward, shouting hoarsely for help as they entered the main street. Two townsmen rushed forward, catching the reins. A woman gasped. "Lord Almighty, what happened?" "Mining camp," Ruth said through gritted teeth. "He's been shot. Please, get the doctor." They carried Jonah into the marshal's office, laying him across a cot. The town doctor appeared, sleeves rolled, expression grim. As he worked, Ruth paced near the door, hands trembling. Every scream, every flicker of pain from Jonah's mouth tore at her chest. After what felt like hours, the doctor stepped out, wiping his hands. "Bullet passed through clean. He'll live, if he rests." Ruth sagged into the chair, relief washing over her. But Jonah's voice came from the cot, hoarse and steady. No time to rest, she turned. He was sitting up, pale as paper but with fire in his eyes. "Where's the marshal?" The doctor protested, but Ruth already knew. Nothing would stop him now. Moments later, Jonah and Ruth stood before Marshal Harper, a stern man with a gray mustache and weary eyes. Jonah set a worn ledger on the desk, one he'd taken from the wrecked camp. "Evidence," he rasped. "Names, ledgers, contracts, every man Holt bought, every death he buried." Harper flipped through the pages, brow furrowing. This is enough to hang half that company." "Then hang 'em," Ruth said sharply. "Every last one who thinks they can own another human soul." The marshal looked between them. "You two'll need to testify," Jonah nodded. "That's why we came." Ruth turned to him, her voice low. "You don't have to do this. You've done enough." He met her eyes. "Not till I face what I ran from." The next morning the courthouse was filled. Ranchers, townsfolk, freed miners. Word had spread fast. At the front, Jonah Pike stood under oath, his arm bound in a sling, his voice echoing through the room. He told them everything. The chains, the mines, the beatings, the way Holt's men worked people till they broke, body and soul. He spoke without flinching, without hiding behind shame, and when his voice cracked, Ruth stood in the back, hands clasped, eyes steady, holding him up without a word. By the time he finished, the room was silent. Even the judge seemed carved from stone. Marshal Harper stepped forward. "The court recognizes Holt Mining Company guilty under federal law, unlawful bondage, conspiracy, murder." He slammed the gavel down. "Effective immediately, the camp is disbanded. Assets seized. A murmur rippled through the room, a sound like the wind after a storm. Jonah exhaled, shoulders shaking. Ruth came to him then, resting a hand on his uninjured arm. "It's done," she whispered. He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time there was no guilt in his eyes. Only peace. "Maybe now," he said softly. "We both get to start again." They walked out together into the sunlight. The air felt different, lighter, freer. Mesa Ford buzzed with life, people greeting one another, miners shaking hands, children running barefoot through the dust. Somewhere behind them, a man's voice started humming an old tune, the kind once sung by the chained, now sung by the free. Jonah stopped at the edge of town, breathing in the morning air. Ruth glanced at him. "You're smiling," she said. "Guess I finally got reason to." Winter crept softly over Mesa Ford that year. Snow dusted the rooftops and melted on the breath of morning. The town, once little more than a stop on the stage line, now hummed with quiet purpose. The mine no longer loomed over it. Only the sound of hammers, saws, and laughter replaced what used to be the cries of men underground. Ruth Calder stood on the porch of her small boarding house, apron dusted with flour, watching the sun rise over the flats. The sign out front read Calder House, rooms for travelers and honest work for the willing. Inside, a kettle whistled, and the scent of biscuits filled the air. She turned the sign in the window to open. It had taken months to build, nail by nail, brick by brick. But she'd done it, not alone, never alone. From across the street came the familiar thud of wood against wood. Jonah Pike stood at a half-built frame of a home, hammering planks into place. His arm still bore the scar where Holt's bullet tore through, but he swung like a man reborn. A group of freed workers helped beside him, men and women from the mining camp, now rebuilding their lives. Some had families waiting in distant towns. Others had no one but the people standing beside them now. Jonah wiped sweat from his brow and looked up. Ruth was watching him. He gave a small nod, a ghost of a smile. She returned it, that same wordless understanding that had carried them through dust, fire, and blood. Later that afternoon, Jonah walked up the steps of the boarding house, leaving his gloves on the railing. "Room smells like heaven," he said, stepping into the kitchen. Ruth chuckled. "Smells like hard work." "You hungry?" "Always." She handed him a plate and poured 2 cups of coffee. They sat at the small table near the window, the light falling over their faces. Outside, the laughter of children carried through the crisp air. "Town's changin'," Jonah said quietly. "Didn't think I'd live to see it." Ruth stirred her cup. "You helped make it change." He shook his head. "I just swung a hammer." "No," she said gently. "You faced the man who kept others in chains. That's what built this place." He fell silent for a while, gaze drifting toward the horizon. "Funny thing," he murmured. "When I broke your chains that day, I thought I was setting you free. Truth is, you did the same for me." Her eyes softened. "Freedom's not something one person gives another, Jonah. It's something they choose to walk toward, together." For a long while, neither spoke. The wind whistled through the slats. A church bell rang in the distance. Ruth rose, setting her cup down. "Come with me," she said. He followed her outside to where a small grove of young cottonwoods had been planted along the riverbank. Each had a strip of cloth tied to its trunk, and white, blue, red, fluttering in the wind. "What's this?" he asked. "Names," she said softly. "For every soul the mines took. For the ones who didn't get out." Jonah stood there, hat in hand. "You remember all of them?" "Not all," she admitted. "But remembering some is better than none." He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a single link of chain. Rusted, broken, the same he'd used to free himself the night he went back for her. He knelt and pressed it into the earth beneath one of the trees. "Then let this one stand for all of us," he said. Ruth's hand found his shoulder. "It already does." They stood together as the wind picked up, tugging at her hair, scattering light through the leaves. The sun dipped lower, casting long golden lines across the ground. Mesa Fort was quiet again, not the silence of loss, but of peace hard won. Jonah looked at her then, the faintest smile breaking through the lines of his face. What now? Ruth tilted her head, eyes bright. Now we live. We build. We help others walk out of their chains. He nodded slowly. Reckon I can live with that. As evening fell, lanterns flickered to life across town. Jonah turned to head back to the frame house, but Ruth caught his arm. Jonah, she said, you don't have to keep moving anymore. He paused, the meaning sinking in. I know, he said finally. Guess I'll stay a while. And so he did. Days turned to weeks, and the boarding house became a home for travelers, the lost, the weary, the hopeful. Jonah built more than walls. He built trust, laughter, and a future worth staying for. On the porch each night, Ruth would light a lantern and leave it burning, a beacon for anyone still wandering, searching for freedom. Sometimes Jonah would sit beside her, boots resting on the rail, both of them quiet as the stars opened above. No words needed. Just peace. Two souls once chained by guilt and pain, now walking free, side by side beneath an endless western sky. If this story moved you, hit like to help it reach more hearts. Subscribe for more powerful Wild West tales of courage, freedom, and redemption. And tell me in the comments, what does freedom mean to you?